So it's just a quick lecture, just to touch base on what is scalability and high availability. This is quite beginner's level, so if you feel very confident about these concepts, feel free to skip this lecture. But scalability means that your application system can handle a greater load by adapting. And so there are two kinds of scalability. There's going to be vertical scalability or horizontal scalability, also called elasticity. And so scalability is different from high availability. They're linked, but different. So what I want to do is deep dive into all this distinction, and we'll use a call center as a fun example to really put into practice how things work. So let's talk about vertical scalability. Vertical scalability, that means that you need to increase the size of your instance. So let's take a phone operator, for example. We have a junior operator and we just hired him. He's great, but he can only take 5 calls per minute. Now we have a senior operator and he's much greater. He can take up to 10 calls per minute. So we've basically scaled up our junior operator into a senior operator and he's faster and better. This is vertical scalability. As you can see, it goes up. So for example, in EC2, our application was on a T2 micro and we want to upscale that application. That means maybe you want to run it on a T2 large. So when do we use vertical scalability? Well, it's very common when you have non-distributed system, such as a database. So it's quite common for a database, for example, on RDS or Elasticache. These are services that you can just scale vertically by upgrading the underlying instance type. Although there's usually a limit to how much you can vertically scale, and that's a hardware limit. But still, vertical scalability is fine for a lot of use cases. Now let's talk about horizontal scalability. Horizontal scalability means that you increase the number of instances/systems for your application. So let's take again our call center. We have an operator and he is being overloaded. I don't want to vertically scale it. I want to hire a second operator and now I've just doubled my capacity. Actually, I'll hire a third operator. You know what? I'll hire 6 operators. I've horizontally scaled my call center. So when you have horizontal scaling, that implies you have distributed systems. And this is quite common when you have a web application or a modern application, but remember that not every application can be a distributed system. And I think it's easy nowadays to horizontally scale thanks to the cloud offerings such as Amazon EC2, because we just right click on the web page and boom, here is Sagan. All of a sudden we have a new EC2 instance and we can just horizontally scale our application. Now let's talk about high availability. High availability, that goes usually hand in hand with horizontal scaling, but not all the time. High availability, that means that you're running your application or system in at least 2 data centers or 2 availability zones in AWS. And the goal of high availability is to be able to survive a data center loss. So in case one center goes down, then we're still running. So let's talk about our phone operators. Maybe I'll have 3 of my phone operators in the first building in New York. And maybe I'll have 3 of my phone operators in the second building on the other side of the United States, in San Francisco. Now, if my building in New York loses their internet connection or their call connection, then that's okay, they can't work. But my second building in San Francisco is still fine and they can still take the phone calls. So in that case, my call center is highly available. Now, high availability can also be passive. For example, when we have RDS multi-AZ, for example, we have a passive kind of high availability. But it can also be active, and this is when we have horizontal scaling. So this is where, for example, I have all my phone calls in 2 buildings in New York. They're all taking calls at the same time. So for EC2, what does that mean? Well, vertical scaling, again, increasing the instance size. It's called scale up or down. So for example, the smallest kind of instance you can get in AWS today is T2 Nano, and this is 0.5 gigs of RAM, 1 vCPU, and the biggest is a UT12TB1 metal, which has 12.3 terabytes of RAM and 450 vCPUs, so quite a big instance, and I'm sure these things will get bigger as time goes along. So you can vertically scale from something very, very small to something extremely large. Horizontal scaling, that means you increase the number of instances you have, and in AWS term, it's called scale out or scale in. Out when you increase the number of instances, in when you decrease the number of instances. And this could be used for auto-scaling groups or load balancers. And then finally, high availability is when you run the same instance of the same application across multiple AZ. And so this is for an auto-scaling group that has multi-AZ enabled or a load balancer that has multi-AZ enabled as well. So that's it. Just a quick rundown. So we're fine on the terms high availability and scalability. They're necessary for you to understand when you look at the exam questions because they can trick you sometime. So make sure you're very confident with those. They're pretty easy when you think about it. Remember the call center in your mind when you have these questions. Okay, that's good. I will see you in the next lecture.